Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. It will hopefully not be a surprise to anyone that in 2016 and 2020, US presidential elections were marked by large polling errors. In 2016, Clinton's national support was overestimated by about 1.3 points, actually pretty close. But the polling error in swing states was large. In 2020, Biden's national support was overestimated by about 3 points, and the swing state polling errors were even larger than they were in 2016. And you can kind of see this in our own data. If you look at our weighted 2016 and 2020 post-election survey in the UAS, you can see that in both cases we've underestimated Trump's support by underestimated his support by about 2 points, and especially overestimated Biden's support. Now, AAPOR put together a post-2020 task force to sort of look at reasons why this polling error might have emerged, and they had two explanations that have to do with partisanship. One is simply that we're recruiting too many Democrats and too few Republicans in these polls. The other is that the Democrats and Republicans who are responding have different opinions than those that don't respond. But as they note, the source of this polling error can't really be identified without knowing how respondents and non-respondents compare, and we don't have any, we can't ask non-respondents things because they don't respond. So I'm not going to resolve the polling error question today, but I am going to use this as kind of motivation for how could we potentially compare respondents and non-respondents. In the UAS, we have a recruitment file, which at some point will be made available, or at least a recruitment document that we're putting together will be made available. And we know where we sent our recruitment package. We know who responded to that recruitment package. And we know when they filled out our intake survey if they said they wanted to complete future surveys. And so we have all the geographic information associated with that recruitment file. So we can actually merge into that file vote returns by county, as well as census tract demographic information. So even though we can't compare individually respondents and non-respondents, we can compare the geographic, political, and demographic characteristics of those that respond and don't respond to our survey. So the question here is, do these political characteristics impact recruitment into the study? So basically what I'm doing here is just merging county level voting data and census tract demographic information with our recruitment data and estimating the likelihood that someone returns our intake survey, and conditional on returning that intake survey if they'll consent to more studies. So the two independent variables here are just intake survey if they returned it or didn't return it, and then consenting to more surveys conditional on having returned the intake survey. So county level information, I merged both 2016 and 2020 Republican vote share and control for county population. And with the census tract information, I control for proportions of race, education, age, gender, the proportion below 200% of the poverty rate, and the tract's population. Now, once they fill out the intake survey, I do have some information about these individual respondents. So even if they don't consent to future surveys, in the intake survey, we ask about their race and their education. So once they fill out the intake survey, we have that information. So this is looking at the probability of returning the intake with 2016 and 2020 county Republican vote share, 2016 on the left, 2020 on the right. And you can see that the probability of returning the intake does drop with an increase in county Republican vote share, but this drop is relatively small. So for 2016, going from your kind of most Democratic counties to your most Republican counties, the probability of returning the intake only drops by about 3%. In 2020, over that same range, it drops by about 2%. Now, when it comes to consenting to future surveys, which is what they need to do to become a part of our panel, we don't find any significant effect of vote share on consenting to surveys in the UAS, conditional on returning the intake survey. So does this drop really have any consequences for representation in the UAS? Not really. If you actually look at the average county Republican vote share of those that return the intake versus those that don't return the intake over all of our recruitment batches here, you can see that it actually tracks pretty well. So there isn't a huge difference in that vote share between those that return and don't return the intake. And if you actually look at the makeup, the average county Republican vote share of our members and non-members, it's very similar. So there's almost no difference in that average county Republican vote share between members and non-members, and that red bar, or that red line in each of these graphs, is the real national Republican vote share, and you can see it's even pretty close to that as well. But maybe we're recruiting different types of people in each of these counties, and in fact, when you run interactions with education, that is what you see. So in places with low county Republican vote share, each of these lines are the proportion of the census tract that has a bachelor's degree. And you can't really see the colors as well as I'd like, but in each of these, that very top bar is the most educated census tract, where over 50% of the population has a bachelor's degree. And you can see that in counties with low Republican vote share, those in highly educated census tracts are much more likely to respond. And that basically disappears as you get to counties with high Republican vote share. So the higher educated respondents seem to be more likely to respond, but only in Democratic counties and not in Republican counties. And this trend continues when we look at consenting to future surveys as well. So those that indicate they have bachelor's degrees are more likely to consent to future surveys in counties with low Republican vote share, but in counties with high Republican vote share, they're less likely to consent, and in fact, those who have a high school degree or less are more likely to consent in Republican-leaning counties. And you can kind of see these results when looking at our own membership. So if you were to just pull out someone out of random, out of the census tracts that we've sent recruitment packages to, in Democratic-leaning counties, about 35% of them would have a bachelor's degree. But in our sample of members, it's about 55%. In Republican-leaning counties, you'd expect about 25% of them to have a bachelor's degree. But in our members, it's almost 40%. So actually, the education gap between Republican and Democratic counties is larger in our membership than it is in reality. So basically, the issue here is we're recruiting different types of people in each of these types of counties. If I apply the base weights here, we can't apply the post-stratification weights because we are including members and non-members here. But if I include the base weights, this gap shrinks a little bit, but it doesn't resolve completely. So conclusions here that in Republican voting counties, they're slightly less likely to return the intake survey, but these effects, again, are very small and don't really impact political representation, at least in our panel, in terms of recruiting from these counties. But the higher educated are less likely to return the intake survey and consent to future surveys, but only in Republican counties. And in Democratic counties, the higher educated are more likely to respond. This might be somewhat of a concerning result if you actually look at the political preferences of highly educated Democrats. They tend to be very different. Like the gap between higher educated Democrats and lower educated Democrats tends to be much larger than the gap between highly educated Republicans and lower educated Republicans. So basically, we seem to, at least in our recruitment, have less of a between-party non-response problem, and perhaps more that the Republicans and Democrats who are responding are perhaps a little different than those that don't.